Hello, friends. First of all, welcome up all of you in this video lecture series of 12th Commerce Economics. Before starting this lecture, I just revised what we studied in previous video lectures. From previous lectures, we start B part of third topic, that is elasticity of demand. So far we completed types of elasticity of demand, meaning definition of elasticity of demand, types of price elasticity of demand, methods of measuring price elasticity of demand, and the next and the last content of the topic, that is importance of elasticity of demand. The elasticity of demand, how to calculate the elasticity of demand, percentage change in price, percentage change in quantity demanded with response to percentage change in price for a particular commodity. This concept of elasticity of demand is having a great importance to producer, to farmer, to worker, and to the government. Lord J. M. Keynes or John Maynard Keynes considered this concept to be the most important contribution of Alfred Marshall. Most important contribution of Alfred Marshall. With the help of following points, we studied, or we are going to study, the importance of elasticity of demand. So the first point is importance to a producer. Then what is meant by producer? The firm engage in creating, manufacturing something new in terms of goods, that is production unit. Every producer has to decide the selling price of the product. Every producer has to decide selling price for his or her product. For this purpose, elasticity of demand becomes important. If elasticity of demand for a product, if a demand for a product is relatively inelastic, if a demand for the product is relatively inelastic, then what is meant by relatively inelastic demand? When a percentage change in price leads to less than proportional change in quantity demanded, demand is said to be relatively inelastic. For example, if a 50% fall in price leads to 25% rise in quantity demanded, So if M is the producer in the market of production of particular commodity, he is taking in his unit or plant a particular production of particular commodity, and the demand for his product is relatively inelastic. Relatively inelastic means the price falls by 50%, demand rises by 25%. That is a relatively inelastic demand. Then at that time, if demand is relatively inelastic, Mr. M fix a higher price. Mr. M fix up higher price for his product. Mr. M fix up higher price for his product, and vice versa. This concept of elasticity of demand is also useful to the monopolist. Monopolist. Then what is meant by monopoly? In monopoly is one of the type of market in which there is a single seller in the market, single producer of the particular product, and he has the control over the supply of the product. He has the control over the supply of the product because he is the sole producer and distributor of that particular product. So how much price to be charged for his product is determined by that monopolist. To make a practice of price discrimination. Price discrimination. Discrimination, monopolists sometimes charge a price for his product, for his relative or his colleagues or his employees he charge less price, and for unknown person he charge more price. So this is the price discrimination. So in this time, to get the profit up to the maximum level, he can charge price in such a way that his profit must be maximized with the tool of price discrimination. With the tool of price discrimination. So demand, that is elasticity of demand, is useful to monopolist also, but how it is useful to the general producer? I say that if demand for the product of the producer is relatively inelastic, is relatively inelastic. Now, what is the situation under which if demand is only relatively inelastic, then the producer charge higher prices? What are the chances, or what is the practical implementation of relatively inelastic demand with the fixation of price for the product? The meaning of relatively inelastic demand, the meaning of relatively inelastic demand, that is percentage change in demand is less than percentage change in price. If Mr. M produce a toothpaste, sorry, if Mr. M produce any goods, but if demand is relatively inelastic, means if 50% change in the fall in the price of the product, demand rises by 25%, means even there is fall in the price, even there is fall in the price of the commodity, Mr. M, there is no any the little bit change or the change in the quantity demanded is not much more. So even fall in the price is more, but change in demand is less. So to keep the demand up to the present level, even though there is fall in the price, even though demand is relatively inelastic, he can charge higher price for his product. That's why if demand is relatively inelastic for the product of the producer, he can charge higher price for his product and get a maximum profit or vice versa. Next, importance of the concept of elasticity of demand to the government. Those goods for which demand is relatively inelastic will be taxed more because it will not affect their demand. For example, the demand of the consumer having habits of tobacco, alcohol, even though there is change in the price, maybe rise or fall, if we take into consideration there is rise in the price, there is any no change in the demand, here we expected that there is fall in the demand, but there is no any fall in the demand is constant or more than that also. But in case of habitual goods, demand is not, if there is rise in the price of habitual goods like cigarette, tobacco, demand will be not affected. That is, demand is relatively inelastic. So for these types of commodities, government can charge higher, government charge higher taxes, government can charge higher taxes or vice versa. Next, important in factor pricing. Factor pricing we studied in first topic, that is introduction of micro and macroeconomics. This is the part, factor pricing is the part and subject matter of microeconomics. And then what are the factors of production? Land, labor, capital, and entrepreneur are the factors of production. Rent, wages, profit, and interest are reward of these factors. So the factor of production for which demand is relatively inelastic can command higher price as compared to those having elastic demand. Workers can ask for higher wages if the demand for their product produced by them is relatively inelastic. Means, if the workers demand higher wages for the product they produced, having demand relatively inelastic, having demand relatively inelastic, so at that time, so at that time If they charge higher prices, or charge if they charge more prices for their product for which the demand is relatively inelastic, there is effect on the demand is not as per the not as per the law, as per the rule of law of demand. That is expected that in law of demand it is expected that if prices are higher demand is less, if prices are less demand is higher. But in case of workers for which their production, the demand is relatively inelastic, means if they charge higher prices for their product, there will be no effect, or the effect is there is less effect on the quantity demanded of the commodity, because demand is relatively inelastic. That's why they can get more wages. Therefore they can get more wages. For example, एक्स कमोडिटीज प्रोडक्शन करणारी एखादी कंपनी आहे एक्स कमोडिटीचं, आणि त्या कमॉडिटीसाठी असणारी डिमांड ही रिलेटिवली इनइलॅस्टिक आहे एक्स कमॉडिटीची. म्हणजे समजा त्या एक्स कमॉडिटीची प्राइस 50% राईज झाली, तरी डिमांड काय 50% कमी होणार नाही. ती झाली तर 10 किंवा 20% किंवा 5-10% होणार आहे. म्हणजे रिलेटिवली इलॅस्टिक डिमांड असणार आहे. किंवा प्राइस 50% कमी झाली तर डिमांड 25% राईज होणार आहे. अशा वेळेला रिलेटिवली इनइलॅस्टिक डिमांड असल्यामुळं त्या एक्स कमोडिटी वर्कर्स हायर वेजेससाठी डिमांड करू शकतात त्यांच्या कंपनीच्या ओनरकडं. नेक्स्ट, इम्पॉर्टन्स इन फॉरेन ट्रेड. द कन्सेप्ट ऑफ इलॅस्टिसिटी ऑफ डिमांड इज यूजफुल टू डिटरमाइन टर्म्स अँड कंडिशन्स इन फॉरेन ट्रेड. The countries exporting commodities for which demand is relatively inelastic can raise their prices. For example, OPEC, all petroleum exporting countries, have increased the prices of oils several times. The concept is also useful in formulation of export-import policy of a country. This concept is also helpful for the import-export policy of to decide import-export policy of the country. That is importance in foreign trade. Then how the elasticity of demand, or this concept, is helpful to decide terms and conditions and formulation of policy of export and import. Here I told you one example. The countries exporting commodities which demand is relatively inelastic can raise their prices. Relatively inelastic can raise their prices. That is, if there is 50% rise in the prices, demand falls by 10-15% or 20%, not more than that. So If the price of the commodity, for example, in case of OPEC country, that is oil petroleum exporting countries, if the price of one barrel of crude oil is $100 and demand is relatively inelastic for crude oil, so at that moment, if they rise the price, and when price is for one barrel is $100, so at that time only 10 barrel can be demanded. But when due to relatively inelastic demand, if the company or OPEC countries rise the prices of one barrel to one from 100 one barrel to 120 for one barrel, so at that time the demand fall for $8 when the price of the barrel is is 120, means 10 demand falls from 10 barrel to 8 barrel, so at that time, but the prices also rises from 20 to 100 to 120 per barrel. So by selling 8 barrel by OPEC countries, they get an additional revenue of rupees 160. So they can charge higher prices because the demand for crude oil in that particular period is relatively inelastic. So to decide the concept, to decide the terms and conditions of foreign trade, this concept is useful. Next, public utilities. In case of public utilities like railways, which have an inelastic demand, government can either subsidize or nationalize them to avoid consumers' exploitation. Public utility services means infrastructure services, road, public transport, railway, monorail, metro rail, public bus transport. So all these are the public utility services, road constructions. So public utility services have an inelastic demand. Government can either subsidize or nationalize them to avoid consumers' exploitation. Next,